My name is Hillary Symington, and I am an alumna from the class of 2014. I am the leader of the Barnard Club of Austin here in Texas. As a quick reminder, this online event enables an attendee to participate through a personal device's microphone and or camera. An attendee may elect not to participate through.
You got muted.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Thank you. Thank you. We left off right with y'all heard I'm here, Hillary Symington here in Austin, Texas. Okay, cool. I'll pick up from there. As a quick reminder, this online event enables an attendee to participate through a personal device's microphone and or camera. An attendee may elect not to participate through use of a microphone and or camera. The election of an attendee to use a microphone and or camera constitutes a release and waiver of rights in the capture of the attendee's image, likeness, and or voice for the exclusive use of Barnard College. Before we get started, I would be remiss not to mention the racial and political unrest taking place in the U.S. and around the world as we speak here today. Systemic racism and violence against people of color, particularly Black Americans, is not a new phenomenon. But especially in the context of a global pandemic, these inequities are magnified and brought to the forefront for everyone to face. The Barnard community is dedicated to tackling these issues, and we are here to lift each other up in difficult times. We are continuing with alumna events and programs like this one, as we believe it is meaningful to the community to provide a platform for alumni to connect, to engage, and to learn from the college and each other. I know I'm really happy to see y'all. Today we are going to hear from Cecilia Monk from the Barnard class of 2010 and Provost Linda Bell, after which I will jump back in to moderate the audience Q&A. Please use the chat function to submit your questions throughout the program. With that, it is now my pleasure to introduce Linda Bell, Provost and Dean of the Faculty, who will moderate the conversation today. Provost Bell is also Claire Toe Professor of Economics at Barnard. In addition, she is a research fellow at the Institute for the Study of Labor, IZA, in Bonn, Germany, and a senior consultant for the Labor Practice Group of the National Economic Research Associates. Provost Bell is an empirical economist specializing in labor markets and public policy. She has written and lectured extensively on the topic of compensation, union concessions, and hours of work in the US and Europe. Her recent research focuses on the determination of gender compensation differences in executive pay in large US corporations generally, and on female mentorship at the executive level specifically. Linda, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Hillary. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. I love being with Barnard Alumnae, and I've had the opportunity to do so on multiple occasions. It's much more fun in person, I can say that, but we have to take what we can get these days. So thank you all for joining, and thanks for being part of this, and thanks to Hillary and crew for organizing it from Austin, Texas. So it is my sincere pleasure to introduce Cecilia Monk from the Barnard class of 2010. Cecilia is a Brooklyn-based writer and an author of 3 books. And I had the pleasure of meeting Cecilia earlier in the semester before we were all in our own little spaces for a celebration of Mary Gordon's work. As many of you know, Mary Gordon will be retiring this year from Barnard. So Cecilia was back to celebrate really the accomplishments of that phenomenal faculty member and of the creative writing program, which is a fabulous program at Barnard. But Cecily's debut novel, which was published in 2015, I believe, entitled Diamondhead, is the subject of today's book talk. It was a Barnes & Noble Director Great New Writers selection. It was a recipient of the Elle Magazine's Reader's Prize, and it was also voted the best debut novel of the Brooklyn Book Festival. Mary Gordon said of her former student's book Diamondhead takes the family to a new and a very high place. And that's a quote from the jacket of the book. And the New York Journal of Books exclaimed that in Diamondhead, Cecilia Wong has crafted a delicate tower of mystery and history. Wong's prose is both lyrical and poetic. So Cecily Wong is also the author of Atlas Obscura's food book called Gastra Obscura, which will be released in the fall of 2021, and a second novel, Kaleidoscope, which is published by Dutton and forthcoming in the spring of 2022. So thank you for being with us, Cecily. Can I ask you to unmute and officially join this meeting now? Are you on?
Am I here?
Yes, you're on.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. This is so great. Happy to see so many Barnard women.
Sure, we're thrilled to have you. So I'm going to suggest, just for the purposes of this more formal part where we get to hear what Cecily has to say about her book, that we mute ourselves so that there's no background noise. And then we can all unmute ourselves during the Q&A. And as Hillary mentioned, can always use the chat function. Works really well. I've been in many meetings with 95 plus participants, and it works great to do so. So to kick things off, Cecily, you wrote in your author's note to Diamondhead that this novel aspired to be both historically factual and also infused with a personal narrative of the encounter of Hawaii and its history, and that in doing so, you chose a location that was close to you, neighborhoods where your grandparents and parents lived, and that were real to you and their reminiscences, even if they didn't actually exist in Oahu. So can you share with everyone the thinking that went into the mix of historical research and personal narrative, along with what inspired you in writing Diamondhead?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm from Hawaii. I was born in Hawaii. My whole family lives there. Both sides, 4 sets of grandparents, a whole sprawling family on Oahu. And my parents were the first two of both of their families to leave Hawaii and to take us to Oregon. And I was 7. And I think that that might have been like the largest cultural shock I've ever experienced in my life. And I've moved many times since then. But, you know, I went from being Chinese on an island full of Chinese people, a huge family, lots of relatives, to being Chinese in Oregon. And it was something that I spent a lot of time thinking about. And it's weird looking the way that I do and being connected to Hawaii, but not really not knowing too much about it because I was so young. And so yeah, that was always a little confusing for me. But what I did have was with my parents and their stories. And when my grandparents came to visit, I had their stories. And that's how I learned about Hawaii to begin with. And so when I started writing this book and doing the research for the first time, some things didn't match. Of course, memory doesn't always perfectly match history. And so I started with making everything trying to match, and realized, you know, this is a family story for me. It's a personal story. And so there were some things that I wanted to keep. There's a house in the neighborhood of Hawaii Kai where the family eventually moves, and they move there before it exists. But I whenever I go to Hawaii, I go to that house. My grandparents live there still. They live on the marina, and that house is so special to me that it had to be there. By the time I was reconciling it with history, it was already kind of a character in the book. And so I remember asking my editor, can I keep it? And she said, you can do whatever you want. And so it stayed. And so a number of those things stayed. And, you know, the account of what it was like in Pearl Harbor, where my other set of grandparents live, wasn't exactly the way I read about it in Pearl Harbor books. And so there were times where I favored their version of history. And so it's kind of it's fiction.
But I have to say, I think I mean, from my perspective, it works beautifully.
Thank you.
It's a kind of very personal narrative, but it's grounded in some events that we know transpired that were deeply impactful, not just to Chinese families living in Hawaii, but to all of us as a nation. So the tilt works fantastically from my perspective. So am I right that you published this book just 5 years after graduating from Barnard?
Yes.
Okay, so it takes some of us economists 5 years to publish a paper. So you published a book in that 5-year period of time. So my question is, like, how did Barnard inspire this creativity, this productivity? Did this have anything to do with your kind of Barnard years? Does it come from anything that happened at Barnard?
It has almost everything to do with Barnard. I started writing it at Barnard, I guess is the first thing to say. I started writing it with Mary Gordon. She was my first and actually my only writing professor. And so I came, I think, not really knowing that novelist was a career path to be chosen. And Mary was the first, real live working novelist that I ever met, that made it seem kind of possible. But even while I was writing it, I had no idea that was something that could happen. Basically, I took her story class 3 times in a row. I was a transfer student. I transferred when I was a sophomore. I was an Italian major, and I started taking Mary's class, and I started working on the story, and it was set in Hawaii, and she told me to just keep with it during those 3 semesters. So I worked on the story for 1.5 years, and so much came out of Barnard and out of that class, craft-wise. I don't come from a family of writers. There's not a single writer in my family. My parents owned a restaurant. Lots of engineers, lots of practical jobs, and I started writing the story, and at the end I had 50 pages, none of which appear actually in the book, which is the fun part about writing novels. But it ended up, those 50 pages ended up winning a prize, actually a Barnard Prize. And Mary talked to me after graduation, and she said, Cecily, I think you have something if you are interested in turning this into a novel. And it was honestly the first time I ever thought that it could be a novel. And I don't think that Mary, still to this day, I've tried to tell her a million times, but I don't think she quite understands how much I took that to heart and how much I clung to that faith for the next 2 years as I expanded those 50 pages to 300. And she was there. When I did that event with her in February, I read through all of our emails over the last decade now, and it's just me emailing her every few months in desperation, asking her, when does it end? And she was always there, and she helped shepherd it through, and yeah, so it all started at Barnard.
That's such a wonderful story, and Mary has singularly produced so many great writers. I mean, you join a really distinguished group of Barnard alumni writers. Several writers have described the act of writing as being extraordinarily solitary. So I'm just wondering, in the 2 years post Barnard, or 2.5 years till your novel took form, did you rely on anyone else? Do you have a writing group that meets regularly? Is it really just you and the typewriter and sheets of paper?
Yeah, well, so for Diamondhead, I've since written a second novel, which has been a completely different experience, but Diamondhead was intensely solitary just because I had no idea what I was doing, and I didn't know any other writers. As I said, I was an Italian major. I didn't even know that MFAs existed until I had a book. And I wrote the whole thing really in this kind of deep vacuum of fear and stubbornness. and I didn't know anyone to talk to, frankly. It was just me. And I have a handful of girlfriends from Barnard who read drafts along the way, and we all kind of, none of us are I was an aspiring fiction writer, and everyone else was, doing other jobs that were outside of fiction, and we kind of all, I got some help, but it wasn't through writing groups or programs or anything like that. And I remember, I want to say 3 months before Diamondhead came out, I realized that I didn't know a single other writer that wasn't Mary Gordon. And that was shocking to me. And I was starting to see other writers who were about my age, and they all seemed to know each other. They'd come through programs together. And so I asked Mary Gordon out to lunch, and I said to her, do you have any friends for me? I really would love to meet another writer who's my age, who is releasing a book at a similar time as me. And, Mary's got this massive Rolodex of every writer that's come through Barnard. And so she just sat there and she thought for a little bit, and she said, I have someone for you. And she sent out an email, and she set me up on a blind date with another writer who graduated 2 years before me, had a book coming out 2 months after me. And her name is Julia Pierpont, and she wrote a book, and she's one of my best friends now. And with her, I've started a writers group. And so this book got a lot of help from writers, but Diamondhead was just really learning how to write a book on my own. I'm not sure I was ready to let others in.
Must have been extraordinarily scary to just release it then to an editor or something like that and wait for feedback. It's like a product of so much time and effort, and it's probably a little bit easier now that you're interacting more with more writers. You're sharing drafts, you're sharing ideas. So is that right? Am I on to
Yeah, no, it's definitely, it's nice to have readers that you trust. I mean, obviously I think that reaches across all professions, but no, it's been nice. But sometimes I do look back on, those like 3 vacuum years that where I wrote Diamondhead, not knowing anything about the industry, not knowing if anything would ever be published, if anyone would ever read it. And it was just such a different way to write a novel that I'll never be able to do again. So it's kind of nice that got to happen for this book.
Yeah, good. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Diamondhead. So one aspect of Diamondhead that stood out to me is the unique way in which the story is told, where you weave both across distance and time. And I think it works really well. Why did you decide to tell the story in this kind of nonlinear way?
Sure. I wish I had a brilliant answer for you, but really it happened kind of by accident. It was the only way that I could find to tell this story. As I said, all the stories that I got from Hawaii were told to me by others. And so I think that the most natural way for me to tell the story was having the stories be told to different characters. And so that's kind of how it ended up unfolding, is that the youngest daughter, Teresa, becomes this kind of vessel for all of her family's stories that she's not a part of, but hears secondhand. And so, I mean, truth be told, the scenes that take place in the most contemporary time, I rewrote that story 3-4 times. That was being rewritten and slotted in and scrapped and rewritten. And so this was the first time where it felt like it all made sense, and it came together. And so yeah, I mean, the story spans 80 years of history, and so to do that linearly would be a completely different book. And yeah, I think I wanted to anchor it in Hawaii, and then send the characters back in time.
I think with the tilt towards the personal narrative too, that aspect of the book works really well, because it's kind of the story told through the eyes of someone, kind of, which, and our brains don't think linearly. Our recollections come in pieces. They form like a tapestry, but they're not linear in any way. So it's really very beautifully weaved together. So, so your book spans 3 generations of women. So how how um, how does the role of women change throughout the novel as you see it? Like, what are the relational differences? Um, how do the mother-daughter relationships change? How do they impact the trajectory?
Sure. Yeah, so for those of you who've read it, the book is told by only the women of the novel. And it didn't begin that way, actually. I had male points of view. And at a certain point, I realized that they needed to go because part of showing a story through only women's eyes is to see, you know, how they're withheld from things and how they receive information, and how they're kept from so many things and how their lives are tied to the decisions of men, and sometimes they don't know it until much later. And so for that reason, I wanted to meet the men and let the women tell the story. And I think, you know, obviously over, you know, the 80 years of the story in 3 generations, women's roles do, you know, they change in a certain respect. You know, the first generation, there's a huge emphasis on having boys. You see that with the family, and there's 2 stillborn daughters that don't really matter, and then, you know, all this importance on having a son to carry on the legacy, which is, you know, important in many cultures. But that, you know, that's kind of, I'd say, you know, the peak of devaluing women in the story. And as you get to the later generations, they have Teresa, who is an only child and a girl, and they treat her almost as if she were a boy. You know, they want her to go to school, they want her to study math, they want her to travel, to have a job. And so in that sense, you know, roles do evolve, but I think that at the same time, part of showing such a huge swath of time is showing how much things also stay the same. And Teresa is still governed by decisions that are not her own, and by, you know, a man who takes advantage of her, and by lots of things that she's kept from. And so I think it's kind of, it goes both ways, and that, you know, of course there's evolution that you can point to in the role of women, but at the same time there are these fundamental things that remain, namely that they're tied. I just finished this book called Writers and Lovers by Lily King, which I really recommend. It's very good. But there's this line where there's a famous writer, and there's 2 of his students talking about him, both women, and they say, you know, there are 2 types of women. There are women who want to sleep with him, and there are women who want to be him. And I thought that was very fascinating, and that there, you know, you're often kind of relegated as a woman to choosing between those 2 options, and sometimes not even those 2.
So, how much of the relational part of it, particularly the women's roles, do you think is related to the nature of the story as dealing with a Chinese American or a Chinese Hawaiian family versus a just a general narrative on the evolution of women through 3 generations, of women's roles through 3 generations? How much is specific to kind of, do you think, when you think about the cultural, how much is culture and the unique circumstances of, in this case, your personal family's history impact that?
Sure. I think that all stories are kind of like intrinsically tied to the place and the time that they take place in. When it comes to Diamondhead and Chinese Hawaiian culture, I think that there is kind of an old world inheritance that I wanted to show in the book, and that I think is also displayed in the red string that runs through the whole thing, which is this feeling of fate and of loyalty and of pureness that I think is perhaps starting to fade a little bit as we evolve. But I remember being told, I think that there's a whole swath of humans and women, men, who believe that, you marry once and that's it, and that you have to kind of make yourself believe that there's some divine thing happening that keeps you, attached to who you are. And I see it, as I'm getting older and looking to the generations before me. I have all 4 grandparents. They're all still alive. They're all still married. My parents are still married. There's very little divorce, and yet you see, there's plenty of cracks. That's kind of how marriages work. And yet there's no, it's not really an option to get divorced. And so I think that, so I think that the red string kind of is a symbol of that feeling of being tied to something and not knowing exactly how to get out of it, which I think crosses all sorts of cultural lines, but also, time.
It's really interesting. So I have to ask, because congratulations on having all 4 grandparents. It's really wonderful.
It's incredible. Yeah.
So how did they all react to the book? I'm sure everybody read it and must have been very real and moving and personal to them all.
It was great. When it came out, we threw a big party. I got to go to Hawaii a bunch. That part was wonderful. More than that, I got to spend so much time with my grandparents and just sitting around a table with them and hearing stories from their past that I never got growing up in Oregon. And so that was just a wonderful byproduct of that. But one thing that happened while I was shaping the story is that no one wanted their actual story told. They wanted me to know it, but they didn't want, an expose novel. And so we all kind of worked together to figure out what should go in and what should be withheld. And this was a talk that I had a lot with my mom. And so that's how there ended up being so much history in it, is because I had to make up a lot of parts myself in order to kind of leave my family out of it in a lot of ways. The original, where this book started was from my mother's point of view. And she was actually, she's Teresa's unborn child. And that's where it began. And we realized that if we set it there, it was too real. And I wanted to write fiction. I wanted to write a book that my family wanted to read and that they were proud of, and that they wanted to share with people. And I think that a lot of fiction kind of gets written that way, where it starts very, very close to you, very personal in terms of events and things that and it slowly over years starts moving towards fiction. But my solution to that was just to go backwards and to, get to 1900 where no one could tell me that story, and then you make it up. So,
wow, they must be hugely proud of you. So that's wonderful it's wonderful that they're here to see it, to see it and experience it. So that's fantastic. Are there any takeaways that you would, hope that the reader would remain with the reader when we finish this book?
Yeah. I think that I wanted the reader to be left with kind of a feeling of the huge sprawl of family and of history, and of one thing that is universal really to us all is that we're all attached to people by family, whether it's blood or not. There are so many people who have come before you, and most people, we don't know their stories. And so I've always, in fiction and storytelling in general, I love that kind of rolling and cumulative effect of being a part of something that you don't know the entire story of. And so so there's that feeling of just how you are shaped by this massive thing that you can't see, but also kind of the fate versus destiny thing of things that you inherit cultural legacies, familial legacies, legacies of the heart, all those things, of course, they come into play, but also personal agency, I think, is another thing that it's a fine line. And just to kind of think about your own family and what you've inherited and what you've made your own. I think that was my biggest question while writing this, and something that I still think about.
So you have 2 books coming out. Can you give us a little bit of a preview of Kaleidoscope?
Sure. It's always, I find nothing harder than trying to talk about a novel in like a pitch way. It always sounds like I've written a fake novel. But so this one it's another family story, but this one is contemporary. It opens in the 90s. It is a mixed race family. There's a Chinese mom and a white American father. And they have 2 daughters who are very different, but very close. But it's another family business story as well, in which this family, they like to go on these kind of package tours to Asia. And they end up having an opportunity to build this kind of empire of like kind of eclectic boho crafts and clothes and textiles, and it takes them to New York. The younger daughter goes to Barnard. And
good, thank you for Barnard in the novel.
Of course. Barnard is in so many novels. The more that I read, the more.
One thing, if you end up selling the film rights, make sure that they have Barnard in the film version, because we've been left out of a number of film versions of Barnard related novels. So.
Do they swap it for a different school, or they just leave it out?
Yeah, they sometimes swap it for the school across the street. So
the school across the street.
Right, exactly.
That's a good tip, and I will keep that in mind. So they become kind of problematically successful and wealthy, and it follows their journey, and yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I definitely look forward to seeing that. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'll turn it over to the group, which is, I can't see everybody on Zoom because I'm focused on you, but I assume there are among us some struggling writers, some people who wish that they were published, accomplished novelists like yourself. And so my question is, do you have just any advice for those people who are still struggling with the draft of the novel never completed?
Yeah, I mean, all sorts, really. I find that every novel is kind of its own beast. You know, I struggled through a second one as well. It takes a long time, I think, is the umbrella advice. And I was just saying to my husband the other day that the second book, both books took me about 4 years. And this last book I was writing in tandem with a second nonfiction book. And I was kind of lamenting the fact that I didn't have enough, time to work on the novel. And it occurred to me the other day that I'm not sure it could have gone any faster, even if I had all the time in the world to write it, if I could dedicate to myself entirely. Novels are something that you have to sit with for a really long time. And each one is kind of different depending on the story you need to tell. And people sit on novels for years. Including me. And so there's that time aspect, and the idea that I'm Diamondhead and also Kaleidoscope, I ripped both books apart and I rewrote them cover to cover probably 4 or 5 times. Wow. You throw out everything. So if you have a crappy first, second, third draft, everyone does. They're bad, and they're not bad until they're good. And that takes many, many, many sweeps. And I think one of the biggest piece of advice that I've gotten that's been very helpful to me, because you throw away so much in pursuit of a novel, is that there is so much value in what you throw away, which it doesn't make it to the page, but in words, but it makes it to the page in sentiment and in tone and in history and things that about your characters that make it there, even if you don't get to read the scenes or you don't get to watch them go through school or whatever it is that you have to cut. But that's all the world building. And so so yeah, it's bad, it's long, and it's hard, and then somehow you get there.
So you have a Dropbox for all your novels,
I sure do.
and you keep all the old versions, right?
Yeah, every time I delete a sentence and it goes into another Word document just in case I need it later. I never need it later. They just go, but it makes me feel a little better that they still exist.
Good. Okay, well, thank you. I've really enjoyed speaking with you. I think it's time to open it up to everybody else. So I'm going to turn it over to Hillary and remind everyone that they're mute. They're going to have to unmute in order to ask a question. But thanks, Cecily. It was really fun talking to you.
Thank you, Linda. Thanks for being here. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Cecily and Provost Bell. Wonderful. So that brings us to the Q&A portion of the event. Please feel free to submit questions through the chat or simply unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. It looks like we don't have any, last time I checked. Oh, nope, we got some questions. Okay, the first one I see, and hello to everyone who said hello. It's cool to see so many places represented. Okay, so Jane asks, the truth of Frank's death came out of left field for me. It really ties the book together. Was it totally invented?
So yes, the poisoning was invented, but there's a rumor in my family that there was a great uncle who had 2 wives in China, and the wife in Hawaii only figured this out upon his death. And so that was kind of a juicy morsel that I mined from my own family that ended up making into the book. And so those kinds of things did make it in. And you know, we don't know this relative. He died far before any of us could meet him, and it could just be a rumor. But yes, that came from family lore. But the poisoning, I had to come up with a way to kill him myself.
Neat. Okay, Alexandra asks, toward the end of the novel, Hong explains her revelation about the difference between fate and destiny through the metaphor of the car, which I thought was beautiful and also simultaneously tragic and hopeful in the context of the story. How did you come up with that distinction? Was it your own revelation, something you'd been told? And then parenthetically she adds, also, hello from a fellow transfer student. Thank you for sharing all of this with us.
Awesome. Hello. I love the transfers. It's such a good community. Yeah, I think that, yes, by the time I'd finished the novel, endings are so hard for me. I think they're hard for everyone. But that was really, I guess, the revelation that I had come to, trying to weave the red string into everything, trying to decide, you know, what was within people's control, when they could have pivoted, when they could have made a different decision, all of those things. I think that that's something that lots of us live with, no matter how old we are and what our circumstances. And so I wanted a way to understand, to kind of draw the difference between the two of, you know, a hand that you've been dealt, versus, you know, personal agency and decisions you can make on your own. And so, yeah, so the car thing came to me, and Hong was so helpful as a character, just in the dispensing of wisdom. She was a great vessel for being the person who could kind of see everything in a larger picture, and has been with the family for so long. So yeah, I think that was also that was my summary at the end when I was done writing it.
Thanks, Cecily. We have another question. Shrutivarat asks, I think it's amazing how many different perspectives you chose to portray in the story. And I wondered what your writing process was like. Did you find it challenging to switch between different characters? Did you have a favorite voice?
I had a really hard time switching between characters, and it got really confusing at a certain point. And so what I did is I would just stay in one character for weeks at a time. so that I wouldn't have to come out of it. And because it was difficult transitioning between, 1960s Hawaii and 1900s China. And so if I could just stay in one voice for a stretch until I thought that I'd gotten it done, you get into a rhythm, and pretty soon, that you're on the right track when kind of your character starts speaking to you. And so if you stay in it for long enough, they usually start doing that, and then it comes a little easier. Whereas you bounce around, you have to get back in there. So yeah, so there were full weeks where I thought I was living in an absolutely different time as a different character, and it made for some really weird weeks. I felt very strange, emerging from writing about 1900s China, and then being in Upper West Side apartment, and didn't really know how to talk to people. Like I had a harder time actually, with Diamondhead than with Kaleidoscope, which is contemporary. But yeah, that was a huge challenge, and I don't know that I would take that on again.
That makes a lot of sense. Mary Rosenberg asks if you have any literary influences.
Plenty. I am drawn to contemporary fiction. That's kind of how I fell in love with novels. I didn't read. I don't have like a classics background, and so the person who I cite all the time as the person who taught me to love not reading but like sentences and writing is Jubal Harry, who of course is the Barnard grad. There's something about her writing. It was the first time where I was just kind of blown away on a sentence level, where nothing too much is happening, but there's so much interiority that blew me away. And so she was the first writer who did that for me. I love Jennifer Egan. I love that she does something different with every single book that she writes. I think that that's miraculous. There are certain writers who kind of stick in their lane. And I think that was something that I thought about a lot when thinking about what a second novel would be. And that if I wrote another historical Chinese novel, I might not be able to write, a non-historical Chinese novel ever. So I took inspiration from her and just form and what you can do in the confines of what is considered a novel. And then a slightly controversial love of mine is I love for Junot Diaz's books, and The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde was the book that I read that made me want to write Diamondhead. I read that book and I just thought, wow, I've never read a book like this, and I didn't know that a novel could do something like this. And so his curse in that book inspired my curse in my book. But yeah, plenty more, but.
Did you say The Brief Wondrous World of Oscar Wilde? Did I hear that right?
The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde.
Oh, okay, got it. Thank you. That sounds really good. And the next question is one I had too. There are so many secrets kept by the women in this book. It's mind-boggling. Do you think that it is especially common in Chinese or Hawaiian culture?
I've never thought about this, but yes, absolutely. I think that that Chinese culture can be kind of secretive, and you're not supposed to, especially within a family. And talk about trying to write this book and having to scrub out everything that was too personal and real. That's I'm still carrying secrets for my own family, and I think I would think that it extends to other cultures as well, as although I am my own culture, but I also think that it extends to women in general, that we are supposed to be we're the ones who people come to tell things, and we are supposed to carry this. So yeah.
Thanks. I agree. Jacqueline asks, why was Hung a servant if she was family?
Yeah, I think it was just, I think it's a class structure and just something that happened more often historically, where you would have a, I think it also happens kind of now too, where you can have a domestic helper who becomes like family. I guess it's a little weirder because she was married to Shen, but she's also, she comes from a poor background. Her background is in women's work, and so I think at that time, they even perhaps an unwed sister or an aunt or someone could have performed the same role, which is domestic chores, raising children, cooking, cleaning, and it just so happens that the word servant was a thing that is no longer now, even though that kind of domestic women's work still remains.
Luis has a quick question. Where did you transfer from?
University of Oregon.
Oh, that makes sense. And Nicolette asks, what does Teresa's future hold? What historical American events does she become immersed in? Would you consider continuing her story?
That's a great question. And the truth is, I don't really know. And that's why I won't write a sequel. I've been asked, and it's not, Teresa's story is not the story that I wanted to tell. And so for now, there is no sequel, and I'm kind of leaving it, in my mind, the story kind of ends there. So I think part of being a reader is that it can go wherever you want it to go.
Elaine asked the same question, but she also added that she loved the hopefulness and the reconciliation between Teresa and her mom. And yeah, hope is always nice.
Especially now, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Read the book title. Risa Wyatt asks, Diamondhead is a great metaphor since the mountain was named for the glittering false diamonds, like the deceptive history of the Leongs. Was the red string considered as a title?
Yes, it was. So when we were selling Diamondhead, it's been called a number of things, actually. The publishers love to change titles. And when we were shopping it around, there were 5 publishing houses that were interested in buying Diamondhead. And one stipulation for a publishing house was that they wanted to change the title to the red string. And I wanted it to be Diamondhead. And so I got my way this time. But there are a few foreign editions where the name is the red string. I think the German and the French edition are both, they changed the name to the red string.
I wonder then, if I might ask, how much work did you do with the translations? None.
They do it all for you. It's pretty amazing. It arrives just as a book, in a different language. It's one of the coolest things for me about publishing is the thought of someone spending that much time with your work and considering your sentences and translating them into something that works, that you can't read.
Absolutely, yeah. That's neat. Another question at the sequel. So I think you have an audience in case you decide to.
I know, maybe I should change my mind.
So Annie, Barnard class of 82, asks, she says, I took a creative writing class with Mary Gordon as a junior at Barnard, and I was blown away about how good everyone else in the class wrote. Did you ever have the same impression? You seem extremely confident, as you should be. Diamondhead is a beautifully written book. Were you always so confident as a writer, and how did you develop that?
No, I mean, of course not. Mostly, this is years and years and years. And I think that it's less, I mean, yes, there's confidence involved, but I think that's just a familiarity with with writing being extremely subjective, and that there's so much rejection involved that you just have to, it just becomes part of the path. There's so much criticism involved when you sit around a table and you share, you know, fiction, which is just so deeply personal. You're just putting yourself out there for people to tell you that, you know, you did it wrong, or that they didn't like it, or they didn't get it, or, you know, all of that. And so I think that you go through enough of that. And if you want it enough, for me, I've always thought I've had a good relationship with editing, because my end goal with writing fiction is that I want it to be a story that entertains. You know, I want people to want to read my book, my stories. And so if it's not working, if people are saying, I'm not interested in this, or this isn't working for me, this doesn't make sense, then I would like to look at that. And I would like to, you know, think about how to make it work for people to enjoy it. And so, you know, there's a weird push and pull of like what you want to do as a writer, and what you want to do after the book has left your hands, and for the enjoyment of others. But no, I mean, Barnard is phenomenal. Those writing classes, not only are they filled with so much talent, they're really hard to get into. And Mary Gordon rejected me. You know, she at first she didn't let me in, and I had to kind of do a little bit on my own. And so for me, I think I have a weird relationship with rejection, and that it kind of makes me want it more. And I think that you kind of have to have that when embarking on a project like this. But so many writers have come out of not just Barnard, but the workshops that I was in. And it's great. I think that it's also wonderful to surround yourself with people who are writing sentences that you admire. And it makes you want to write sentences that they admire.
Ashna asked a question a little bit related to what we were talking about earlier about the voices, but she asked about the balance. How did you decide between the balance between first and third person in the novel? She says that she thought the mix was so unique and fun to read.
Awesome. Again, really, I mean, it was trial and error. You know, it was winnowing down. I had 2 narrators, then I had 7. Now I have 5. You know, it was just kind of like seeing, it's reading it until your eyes bleed. You know, you're tracking, you know, shifts of perspective, what you want to read more of, what you feel like you're missing. And so it came together by, again, writing a lot of perspectives that didn't make it into the page, overwriting, editing, and just finding that weird balance that sustains a reader through 300 pages.
And I just want to let everyone know I've been instructed to go until 4:10 Eastern time, or 3:10 Central time. So if you have an eye on the clock, it looks like we still have more questions to go. So,
amazing. Love Barnard women. Amazing.
And this one is me too as well, because I also read your book by listening to it, like Judith. So Judith wrote that she read your book by listening to it. And she asked Cecily if you've heard the audiobook yourself. She thinks it's excellent.
You know, I've heard that, and I know that they did a really excellent job with it, and that they got a different voice actor for every woman, which is phenomenal. I tried to listen to it. It was so hard for me to hear someone else's interpretation of where the emphasis goes, where how the sentences are read, what a character sounds like. It was just such a bizarre experience for me. I think I've listened to about an hour. And so I do have a feeling for how the book works, but I've never listened to audiobooks. And so I just don't have that kind of familiarity with the cadence, the pacing, all of that. And it was, but I haven't done it in a really long time. As I was saying to Hillary, when we were doing a little run through, that I read Diamondhead for the first time as a book for this, and it's been 7 years since I read it. And so maybe it's time to revisit it.
Yeah, I get that. So we have another question, both Bohai, and I'm sorry if I'm saying it wrong.
Don't worry.
And his mother totally fall apart mentally and physically when they find out the truth. I'm curious as to what led you to those reactions. Hong, on the other hand, is a strong survivor. What made her different?
That's a very good question. I think I think maybe everyone just falls apart in their own way. I mean, I think that everyone kind of falls apart at a certain point in the book. For Lynn, hers is so immediate. You know, theirs are tied very, very specifically to the people that they love. Their spouses. Maku Bohai's is tied to Amy, and Lynn's is tied to Frank. And I think that you build a narrative for yourself about what your life means and the importance of different things. And when that turns out to not be true, you kind of lose yourself. And so I think that that's what happened with Lynn and Bohai, whereas I think that Hong's identity might not be tied so closely to who everyone else is. And so maybe perhaps that's why she fared a little better. But yeah, I think it's love, romantic love.
Jenna Rosa asks, she says, being of Italian origin, may I ask what made you major in Italian? Whom did you study with at Barnard and at Columbia University, I imagine?
Yeah, so my senior year of high school, I wanted to take a gap year. I'd heard about it, heard that Europeans were doing it, and I skipped the first grade, and so I was a year younger than all of my classmates, and so I still qualified for some study abroad programs that were accepting seniors. It was an age cutoff, and so I convinced my parents to let me go to Italy for a year before I started college, and I enrolled in a 5th year of high school, in Italian high school. And so it was a fashion design school, which I was so thrilled with. It was so not what I thought it would be. But so yeah, I spent a year there. I lived with a family for 3 months, and then I struck out on my own because I didn't need the credits because I'd already graduated. And so I used the program to go over there. I went to high school. I got a little job. I got kind of adopted by a little Italian group. And I just fell in love with Italy. And I went back every summer. I spent all my money saving for a plane ticket every year. And so by the time I got to Barnard, it was all I wanted to do. Plus I was behind credits wise. And so between those two things, it was Italian. And I love it. I've nursed, I got married there. I've just nursed this like kind of forever love for Italy. And so the Italian department at Barnard is quite small. It was just Nelson Moe when I was there. But over at Columbia, there was Faila, whose first name I don't remember. Wow, you're really jogging my memory now. I'm not going to be able to pull these names right now, but my advisor was Nelson Moe, and actually Mary Gordon was my thesis advisor, because she also has this deep love for Italy. When I was writing Diamondhead, she was writing a book set in Italy, Love of My Youth, and she was there every summer. And so she speaks Italian as well, pretty well. And so she was my thesis advisor, which was awesome.
Neat. Amy just puts in a great plug. Amy writes, Barnard woman leading Barnard woman, exclamation point. I love that. Then Rebecca asks, who is the first author influence that you mentioned? She mentioned the first, whichever of your author influences, the first one you mentioned. I can't remember.
Probably Jubal Harry, I think is what I said.
Okay. Maybe you could write that in the chat when we're done so everyone can look it up. Thank you. All right, Nicolette asks, in the Harper Perennial paperback version, the back cover notes, when its patriarch is murdered on Oahu, the Leong family is thrown into a downward spiral. However, in your novel, this information is not revealed until the end. Is this a spoiler alert? Was this a way to make the ending less of a surprise on the marketing side?
It is a spoiler, and to be honest, I didn't like that on the back cover. But you know, it's funny how they market books, and I think that they were hoping that you would forget by the time that you were a certain certain way through it. But I have heard this multiple times that they did not want to know that Frank died. And so there's a death in my second novel that I'm trying to figure out how to keep a secret. But I don't know.
Marie Rosenberg actually put Jubal Harry's name in.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. And Susan Berkeley says, I loved the book and I loved hearing you talk about it. No question, but I have to hop off and won't have any other venue to say this. You and Jumpa are officially contemporaries, and I congratulate you for that. It's true. And she says, I love her too.
So kind. Thank you.
Bonnie asks, have you always been able to write full time after Barnard?
It's been on and off. When I was in kind of the trenches writing Diamondhead, which was about 2 years, it was just odd jobs. I did all sorts of weird stuff to pay my bills while everyone else was getting real jobs. And it was kind of heads down, and there was a timeline. And then after 2 years, I needed real money, and so I went to work for 2 years. I come from a food family. My parents had restaurants, and so I managed a restaurant in this kind of upscale European grocery store on the Upper West Side. And so I did that for 2 years, and I wrote. And during that time, I sold Diamondhead, and I was able to write full time for a while. Diamondhead enabled me to write Kaleidoscope, which was very, very cool.
Cool.
So as of right now, yes, that may change.
Karen asks, did you meet any other students from Hawaii while at Barnard? I grew up on Oahu and lived there until the age of 18.
Oh, really? No, I don't think I did. I wish I had. Hello.
Maria asks, what triggered you writing this novel in the first place? Was this always in your head?
Yeah, I guess in a certain way. A lot of the stories that didn't necessarily make it into the book were in my head. But in terms of wanting to write a novel, again, no, like it never really crossed my mind. I love to read. I love to read novels. That's kind of still my TV. But I never thought of writing one until it was suggested to me as a real thing that could be done. So, no.
Nancy asks, as an Italian major, did you read your book in Italian? And if so, how true to your original writing is it? Also a sophomore transfer.
Nice. Amazing. Yeah, that is one of my aspirations for my second book, is to get an Italian version. I did not get an Italian version of Diamondhead. So I didn't get to read it in Italian, but I hope to one day be able to read a version. It's a bucket list item as a writer, just in general. Someday it will happen.
Rebecca asks, and this is really a question for Lacey from Alumna Relations, is this interview taped and available afterward? I don't personally know the answer to that, but Lacey afterwards probably will. Cecily, do you know?
I think they're taping it. I'm not sure. Oh, so go ahead.
I can cut in and say, yes, we are recording it, and we will be sharing it afterwards. So
wonderful. Thank you, Lacey. And thank you, Lacey, for putting this all together. I know we're going to thank you again, but really.
Thank you.
Jacqueline asks, in what U.S. state or foreign country has Diamondhead been especially popular? And why?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't, as an author, you don't get a ton of this information. I know that it's done well in New York, Hawaii, and Oregon, where I'm from, for obvious reasons. But I think the foreign edition wise, I think it might have done the best in Germany, but I don't really know. I know that I know that they're reading a lot in Germany, and that they buy a lot of American fiction. That was the first deal that was made. but I don't know. But it has been fun. It's been fun to see people from different countries write reviews that I send through Google Translate, and just to see different takes on what people like across cultures.
Rebecca just wants to extend her feeling that she enjoyed the event and would like to have more. And Jenna Rosa thanks you for answering her question. And Deb asks, I'm a poet who writes in English, but my early studies in classical French verse have definitely influenced my approach to writing. How, if at all, did Italian literature affect your writing? Have you identified traces of Italian styles in your own writing?
That's a very interesting question. In Diamondhead, I'm not sure. I think it might manifest a little more in my second book as I kind of grew as a writer and read a little more, and I was reading more books in translation from the Italian, reading the Ferrantes and whatnot. But yeah, I think that Italian literature, it's so emotional, it's so visceral. You can feel it even in translation, and I think I think that perhaps it comes through a little more in my second book. But yeah, I have a friend who started as a poet in a different language, and you can feel it in her prose, and it feels more lyrical. It feels poetic, and I always think that's a beautiful transition.
Well, thank you so much, Cecily.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. This is really a delight for me, and wonderful to see so many faces and to have so many people engaged with the book. It's really an honor for me. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you all.
And thank you also, Provost Bell, for leading us, and to our guests for showing up, and to Angela and Lacey for they do so much work for you guys on the back, for all of us. So thanks to them too.
Thank you to everybody.